Yeah.
When body at rest will stay at rest until active from opposed force.
Yeah, and how about bodies in motion?
Body in motion will stay in motion until opposing force stops.
Yeah, a body in motion will stay in motion until any other force acts on it. Or in this translation I have here, a body will continue in its state of either rest or uniform rectilinear motion in a given direction as long as there is no force acting against it. The exact opposite of the Aristotelian definition, right? The more Kuhn looked at this, the more he said there's actually no rational reason for choosing one over the other in terms of a statement in itself. Rather, like a Gestalt image, there's simply two different versions of looking at phenomena. One ends up being much more productive over time than the other, but he wants to say that idea that things in motion just stay in motion indefinitely, that's actually by far the less intuitive example. I mean, as a matter of fact, if you think about it, nobody has ever not acted on by another body, right? If such a body would exist, there would be no perceiver of it, right? Simply by you perceiving it or any perceiver perceiving an object, it would have some effect in theory on it. So Kuhn emphasizes that's even actually an ideal typical decision, concept. It's not ever going to truly exist in its absolute form. But it works to start to explain science. Kuhn looks at these and other kinds of examples and starts to say, you know what's interesting about this is it suggests that it's sort of like a Gestalt. You're just taking a similar set of phenomena, motion, and describing it in two totally coherent ways, but two different coherent ways. They're explaining the same phenomena. And from them, you're getting a really different concept, and that starts to become this sort of epitome for him of a difference between paradigms. Indeed, ultimately he's going to say, and this is often lost in this, that the concept of a paradigm conflict is not open to rational discussion. It ultimately becomes simply an initial setting of stakes on initial premises, such as this. How do you define motion? From within that, you can start to have scientific arguments. But real paradigms tend to be of such a form that you simply have to make an initial leap into their assumptions. For Galton, you suddenly define chemistry as all about proportions and proportionality, whereas nobody else was doing that before. And then you start to have the entire field of chemistry defined that way. In physics, these are the sorts of assumptions you make. This becomes important because from that you can start to think of things very differently, right? I mean, famously Galileo with the pendulum, right? You look at this is kind of a little bit washed out there, but that's you can't quite see it, a lamp in the cathedral in Pisa that apparently because of small earthquakes or something, or maybe just because Galileo had somebody go swinging off the top, he would watch swing back and forth. What that looks like to Galileo, literally, retinally looks like, is something totally different since he's going on a new concept of motion that's starting to break away from the Aristotelian one. For Aristotelian people, it looks as if the pendulum is basically a body that's trying really hard to fall, and is being held back by this rope, and therefore is sort of desperately striving to reach the earth, right? Whereas Galileo, for the first time, starts to come up with something close to the Newtonian idea. And he says, actually, bodies in motion are just trying to be in perfect motion. And here we have almost a perfect concept of motion in the pendulum that we can see. And from that, I can start doing thought experiments about what motion means when we start to think of motion as inherently always going until acted upon to stop, rather than only going on by something else, when it's acted on by something else. Does that make some amount of sense? Right, so Kuhn is, among other things, very clever. Right? He not only knows his contemporary physics, he also knows his past physics. And he's able to say a paradigm shift is this kind of change. And this kind of change means you don't need necessarily somebody who's more creative. You need to create a structure in which people start to perceive what used to be an accident in the old system as something, in fact, of profound importance in the new system. And moreover, he argues a little bit more problematically that every system will have such gaps. Whether this is true or not will be a sort of object of big debate. He then, in the book, basically looks at Aristotelian, Copernican, Newtonian physics. Then he looks at Galton, Lavoisier, and other chemists, and looks at all these examples of paradigm shift. And then he attempts to say, okay, so what are the conditions then that make for a paradigm shift? In other words, what causes human beings to start to have this? And this is, again, exactly where Kuhn would disagree with the psychologists. The psychologists are saying, oh, we need some really creative person whose parents brought them up so that they were playing with things all crazy and they learned to think about things in a creative way, like Einstein, right? And exactly on that example, Kuhn would say, Einstein's actually a terrible example for this. Einstein's somebody who was a patent engineer for a long period of time, had a very precise idea of why things are working or not working. Yes, was an extremely creative person, but the creativity was structural. Kuhn would say, as much as it was individual genius. I will get into the Einstein example, we can maybe talk about that more in questions. But basically, he goes through a similar example from Newton to Einstein, saying, similarly, actually, Newtonian physics does a great job explaining almost everything. It just happens to do a crummy job explaining what happens as things approach the speed of light. And it does a crummy job explaining what happens at these extremes of speed or slowness, in fact. But relatively, for everything included, he's doing a great job. And then Einstein simply recontextualizes that. I would just give you a further example here, just to suggest how powerful, say, something like the Aristotelian theory of the world was. Right? Because you tend to think, it's like, yeah, but Aristotle was basically wrong, right? And I think that's what most of us would think, but it's clearly not something to waste your time with. And clearly people who went along with Aristotle's theory were simply living in a backwards world where they didn't have things straight. First of all, here's the geocentric theory. There's the Earth in the middle. You can see the sun. That's your metal pointers. So we're able to use these things. Pointer. Therefore, I can't find where the pointer is. I'm going to try. There, I'll just skip that. Anyway, sun over there, you get the basic idea, not in the middle, right? First of all, it's possible to build a quite good replica of the solar system that works in the 13th or 14th century using the geocentric model. It's really hard for a number of reasons to do it using the heliocentric model, the model with the sun in the middle. Much less to do with elliptical orbits. Right? You've seen it simulated on computers, probably. You've probably never seen a mechanical example. Obviously, back in the day, people only know mechanical examples. So you have immediately something that you can simulate that works pretty well. Here's another example. You then have with that, actually, just as a quick aside, in fact, an invention of something like this. This is in the 1st century. The Antikythera mechanism, which was basically, I would say it was sort of like the iPad of the day, but it would probably be more like having Deep Blue or something in the day, because we actually didn't even suspect such a thing existed. This is a literal pocket calculator. This is what it looked like. They dug it up from a shipwreck. This is the mechanism for it. This is built in the 1st century BC that replicates all astronomical phenomena based on the Ptolemaic Aristotelian model, right? And does, by all calculations, a really good job of it, right? If your model is telling you this is the way the solar system works, and if you can create this kind of mechanism, not that more than a handful of people ever had this mechanism, right? It's telling you when eclipses are going to happen. It's telling you retrograde motion of Mercury. It's telling you all of these amazing things. Then it seems like a pretty great theory, actually. And it's pretty hard to imagine it not working. And on top of that, it matches common sense. Sun rises, sun sets. So this is sort of where he's going with the idea of paradigm. Incidentally, the question is always then, wait, how did they get the timing right if they didn't know about elliptical orbits, right? Because in the Ptolemaic system, it's all circular orbits. It turns out that mechanics, they weren't yet engineers, fudged the system by actually bending the gears so that they would match up. And they have essentially elliptical gears, which is sort of interesting because they weren't thinking of it as an elliptical universe. They just knew it wasn't matching correctly for what their masters, most of them were probably slaves, wanted. So they're just like, well, let's just fudge this a little bit. And they had to create a mechanism that matched this. In any case, again, pretty impressive, and Kuhn wants to say this is science. So what kind of history do you need then to start to understand what's happening here with science? What do you need as a model for thinking about what is going on in science? First of all, Kuhn says you want to switch. As he says, switch the entire focus from science as something that's just out there, where we're copying the world, to looking at it as a communally based activity, with communal norms and standards, like any other human activity. Then within that, he's going to say there are certain circumstances that lead to this notion of paradigm shift and revolution in science. What do you think those might be? I mean, what would be an example of a paradigm? What do you think would be something that would provoke revolution in this sense? Yeah.
Just natural climate change, for instance, or I think our surroundings changing.
Yeah, something changing in what's happening around us. I mean, as a matter of fact, one of the key changes that happens in the switch from the heliocentric from the geocentric to heliocentric is simply a problem with calendars. You know, there's suddenly a Christian issue with calendars. The calendars are not working properly. You're having a whole fight over calendars. Everybody's realizing the system doesn't work precisely enough for that. And that provokes everybody to have to rethink things. But also, as you say, it might be larger phenomena of wide-scale transformations. I mean, something like geological or climate change today would be an example.